Today, we're going to trace a chain of events, kind of like a line of economic dominoes, to see how a European desire for luxury goods ended up creating a system of unbelievable human suffering across two continents. It's a story about how simple cravings can fuel a truly brutal global machine.
So how does that happen, right? How does a simple craving for things like sugar and tobacco just spiral into this massive, systematic trade in human beings that lasts for centuries? Well, to answer that, we've got to look at the one big idea that really lit the fuse. All right, let's get into it. The very first domino to fall, it wasn't a crop or a ship, it was an idea. An economic philosophy that completely gripped Europe. And that philosophy was called mercantilism. The thinking behind it was, well, pretty simple and incredibly ruthless. A nation's power is all about how much gold and silver you've got in the bank. This kicked off this frantic zero-sum game between all the European empires. The more gold I have, the less you have. And that wealth, that meant everything. Bigger armies, stronger navies, basically global domination.
But, there's a problem with that. This relentless chase for gold eventually hits a wall. I mean, there's only so much shiny metal you can pull out of the earth, right? So, these empires had to get creative. They pivoted to a new and, frankly, a much more scalable way to make money.
And this is where you see this huge shift in thinking. Look, digging for gold is a one-and-done deal. Once a mine is empty, that's it. The profit stream dries up. But farming in the Americas? That was a whole different ballgame. The climate there was perfect. You could grow these incredibly valuable crops all year round. It was like a renewable source of wealth. And the only things holding you back were how much land and how much labor you could get your hands on.
So what you get is this green gold rush. I'm talking about crops like sugar, coffee, tobacco. The profits were just astronomical. Back in Europe, people couldn't get enough of this stuff. So these weren't just crops anymore. They were literally the engines of empire. The money they generated was just staggering, and it was all plowed back into more colonial expansion.
Okay, but here's the catch. This incredible new money-making machine, it had a huge bottleneck. To make these giant farms actually profitable, you needed a massive, reliable, and this is key, controllable workforce. And right away, the colonizers hit a major snag.
So their first thought was to enslave the local populations, the indigenous peoples of the Americas. But looking at it from their cold, hard economic point of view, this plan just completely fell apart. And it failed for two big reasons.
First off, the indigenous people knew the land like the back of their hand. They could escape, they could disappear into the forests, which, for the colonizers, made them an unreliable source of labor. But the second reason was even more devastating. They had absolutely no immunity to European diseases, things like smallpox. The death toll was just catastrophic, basically wiping out the very labor force they were trying to create. So now you've got a real crisis on your hands if you're a colonizer. Your whole economic model is about to collapse. So they came up with a new, and truly horrific, solution. They looked across the ocean to Africa. And this is where you see their cold, dehumanizing math at work. The problems they had with indigenous labor, well, in their minds, they had shockingly simple solutions. If you bring enslaved people from Africa, they won't know the land, making it much harder to escape. And this is absolutely crucial, because of centuries of contact between Africa and Europe, many Africans had developed a higher immunity to those same European diseases. From a purely brutal economic perspective, this made them a more durable workforce.
You have to understand, this wasn't just a change in plans. This decision created an entire industrial system for trafficking human beings. And the main gear in this horrific machine was something we now call the Middle Passage. That brutal transatlantic journey that transported millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas.
And this trip was just a prolonged nightmare. I mean, depending on the weather and the route, it could take anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks. 6 weeks trapped in conditions that are almost impossible for us to imagine. And the reason for all the cruelty, it all came down to money. It was just pure economics. To the people running these ships, each person wasn't a person. They were cargo. The more cargo you could cram into the hold, the more money you'd make at the end of the trip. The calculation was that stark. It didn't even matter if a whole bunch of them died on the way.
And the conditions created by that profit-first mindset, they were just hell on earth. We're talking extreme overcrowding, people chained side by side for weeks on end. No sanitation, no fresh air. Disease spread like wildfire.
On top of that, there was starvation and malnourishment. It's no wonder the death rates on these voyages were so horrifically high.
So for the people who actually survived this unbelievable journey, they didn't just arrive at a farm. They arrived in a new world that was being completely re-engineered around this new economic reality. This wasn't just about agriculture anymore. This was about building entire societies from the ground up, all based on the foundation of enslaved labor.
And these places came to be known as planter societies. Think of colonies in the Caribbean, Brazil, the American South. The structure was always the same. A tiny, tiny group of Europeans at the very top, controlling all the land and all the money. And at the bottom, a massive population of enslaved Africans doing the work that made all that wealth possible.
Now, here's the thing. An economic system like that doesn't just work on its own. You need a social system to justify it, to keep it going. And that's exactly what they created. These really rigid social structures based entirely on race. The casta system in Spanish colonies is a perfect example. These were rules that literally wrote a person's rights, or lack of rights, into law, all based on their racial background. It was a way to bake European dominance into the very DNA of these new societies for centuries to come.
And this is the truly tragic part. Once all of these different pieces, the economic greed, the plantations, the forced labor, were on the board, they didn't just sit there. They locked together, creating this brutal, vicious cycle that just fed itself.
So let's just quickly run through the dominoes again. You have mercantilism, which created this insatiable hunger for wealth. You have the climate in the Americas, which was the perfect engine for growing cash crops. You have the tragic factor of disease immunity, which, in the eyes of the colonizers, made enslaved Africans the most durable labor source. And finally, you have the simple, brutal economics of maximizing profit, which fueled all the cruelty.
And that brings us to the engine at the heart of this whole thing. All that money, all those incredible profits from sugar and tobacco. They didn't just go back to Europe to be spent. No, a huge chunk of it got plowed right back into the system. It was used to pay for more slave ships, which brought over more enslaved people, which meant they could build even more plantations. It was a brutal feedback loop that just got bigger and bigger and bigger.
Which really leaves us with one final and I think really important question. Because this wasn't just something that happened a long time ago. This was the birth of a global economic system. It laid the foundation for so much of our modern world. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this: how do those systems of wealth and power, the ones built on that foundation of exploitation, how do they continue to influence the inequalities that we still see all around us today?